Today on Let's Make Bread, we are making Italian feather bread. It's a recipe that is new to the show, very excited, and as an extra special step, I am going to be challenging myself to do this with as few tools as possible. So for this, I have my wooden spoon. I have a, oh my God, what is this called? You know what this is called. My bench scraper. There we go. Wow, I might have to edit that out. Anyway, and a rolling pin, as we will be rolling some bread today. All right. I am going to put in the actual recipe description what the actual steps are. I'm going to be modifying this recipe ever so slightly, not in the ingredients, but a little bit in the process. Okay, so the way to do it based on the book is going to be in the description below, as always. But I'm going to be taking up the challenge a little bit extra just to see if we have a little bit of fun, extra fun with this recipe. All right. With that said, let's get started.
All right, guys, first thing we're going to do is we're going to put our yeast. We have 2 packages or 4.5 teaspoons of active dry yeast. After that, we have 1 tablespoon of sugar that we are adding to 1 cup of warm water. It's about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Then we're just going to give these a quick stir and allow our yeast to bloom for a couple minutes. Don't worry, we'll be busy while it's blooming. Now we have our hot water here. We've got 3/4 cup of hot water. We're talking at least 180 degrees, preferably boiling. We're going to put our butter. We've got 1/3 cup of butter cut into small cubes into there. And then we're going to add some salt. We need 2 teaspoons of salt here. Feel free to add more. You know I'm always guessing on the show with the salt. And that's fine. So we're just going to add our 2 teaspoons of salt, and then we're going to give this a nice little stir. So this actually going to take a really long time to combine because of the butter, so don't worry about if it takes a couple minutes. It's not the end of the world. Just keep stirring. It will combine eventually. Don't give up on it. After that, we're going to, well, I am going to take my little flour mountain here and make it into a flour volcano, our well that we'll be putting our liquid ingredients in. Now we're going to do just that. We will pour in our butter mixture first, although it doesn't matter which mixture you pour in first. After that, we are going to put in our yeast mixture, which has fully bloomed now since we've been working the whole time. Perfect. All right, so this whole thing is going to be started with a wooden spoon. You'll see in the written instructions that you should use a wooden spoon, so I used a wooden spoon here, and I'm just showing you this is quite craggly. Eventually, you're going to have to start folding it in with a bench scraper and using your hands a little bit, which is fine. Again, don't worry about this, and also no need to do the challenge mode that I'm doing. I actually think that when I make this bread again, I will not do it this way. I will stick with the bowl method, as I think I put too much flour on my board here and had to start kneading early. You should only have to knead for about 2 to 4 minutes with this, but I had to knead a little bit longer than that, as you can see, to knead in all the flour that was here. And I didn't even end up putting all the flour in. So just be careful with it. This dough is supposed to be sticky at this point, and it wasn't for me. But the bread still came out wonderful, so no worries there. All right, so we're just going to shape this into a ball and leave it to rise for about 6 minutes. Okay, so at least 6 minutes. Let it rise. Is the only rising it's going to do before we shape it. All right, I am back. Ta-da! And it's risen. Not much. Anyway, we're going to roughly divide this into 2 pieces. It doesn't matter. I'm not weighing things here. You can if you want to, but there's really no point. It's not going to make much of a difference. Then we are shaping each of our 2 balls of dough into an 8-inch by 12-inch rectangle, okay? And there's no need to be as exact as I'm being on this one, but you do get cleaner edges if you are neat about it. So I'm using my bench scraper since it has a 6-inch ruler in it to give me some good sense of what 8 inches by 12 inches is. It will roll much more nicely if you do a good job here. So do take the time if you want that neatness. All right, so now starting from one end, we are going to roll along the longer end, so it'll be 8 inches wide at its end, all the way up to the end there, pinching down each roll. All right, so now we are going to take our tray. Each bread is going to get a tray, and we're using cornmeal. This is when our cornmeal comes in. We're just going to sprinkle that on our baking tray here, just to make sure that we have a nice coating for our bread to go on, and plop, on it goes. And then we're going to repeat this process with the other loaf. All right, at this point we are going to cover these for about an hour, as I will say in just a moment. I'm making sure my tea towel is on there and we're ready to go.
All right, so we have finished making our bread. You can see there in the back rising here. We've got 2 loaves that are rising. It's very exciting. So in the meanwhile, we're going to talk some politics. We've set a timer for about an hour. So if you are here if you're staying for the politics, wait one moment and we will begin. If you're not staying for the politics, just set that timer for about an hour and I will see you when we get back. All right, be right back. All right, there is a ton on our plate to cover this week. There has been a lot of news, and there's just a lot of other things that I wanted to talk about that are kind of relevant. First things first, I think if you're seeing this, it's probably not at our usual time. I just want to give a quick thing about that. The channel's not really growing as much as I kind of hoped it would. If there's feedback that you think will make the channel better, obviously, please let me know. And I'm still taking questions and loaf pictures. I would love to feature one of your guys' loaves on the show if you want. However, because the show is not growing as much and YouTube suppresses content like mine, political content that doesn't come from a major news outlet, we're going to be trying to mess a little bit with the Facebook algorithm to try and post things on Facebook and Twitch when people are most engaged. So if this is not at your usual time, then I'm sorry, but we're just trying to make the channel grow a little better to get the message out to more people. The other thing that's not going to make it to a segment this week is this week was International Holocaust Memorial Day. It is pegged to the liberation of Auschwitz, which was one of the harshest and most brutal of the concentration/death camps. As a Jew, I observe, which is to say I don't eat, and I cease working to make sure that I can kind of take the time to be present for myself, to take time so that I'm not feeling a particular way. And the reason I bring it up is because our whole lives, we're moving and running around and doing all these things, and it's hard sometimes to just take time for yourself. And although the day was not supposed to be dedicated to myself, I did actually end up doing a lot of the things that I probably could have done another time, namely chores and such, but also just kind of spent some time doing things for myself. And I want to say that you shouldn't feel bad about that. When you observe something, there's nothing wrong with the way that you observe it. Even if there's a strict practice about how it's observed, don't feel bad for taking the time that's been given to you to do what you need to do. I think that this is particularly important for Holocaust Remembrance Day because, you know, I'm here as a Jew living in America in a place where there is no official anti-Semitism and I can be Jewish freely. And one of those free Jewish things that I can do is to take time for the festivals and for the fasts and things that I need and not be persecuted for it. So for me, taking the time to have that day more or less for myself, I also feel as if that I am justified in doing that. One, because you should feel justified in taking the holiday any way that you feel fit, but any way that you see fit, but also in taking that time to appreciate the life I have, knowing that my ancestors weren't necessarily so lucky. Also, another thing, and this is just a personal note, there are two Holocaust Remembrance Days. There's the international one, which was this past Thursday, and there is the Jewish one, which is later in the year. The Jewish one, I actually take more seriously, as it were, and I do more religious things. But that's just me, right? Don't take my way of doing things as like the official way or the right way. It doesn't matter. Live in the moments that feel good to you and do the things with the time that you need to do to kind of keep yourself all together. You know, for celebrations or memorials, it can be difficult to not get enveloped in the emotions that are supposed to be surrounding the holiday. And I think it's important for all of us that we just take the time to feel the emotions we want to feel and to exist in the space we want to exist in and be comfortable doing that. And I think if we all did more of that for the times that we are given, whether they're holidays or memorials or anything like that, I think we'd probably do a lot better. We'd all feel a little bit better. So that's just kind of a little aside thing. I took some time for myself this week. I also fasted to dedicate my body in a way that I see fit to, you know, the memory of my ancestors. But just because there are ways to celebrate something. Doesn't mean you have to celebrate it that way. And if you are given time to cease from work, to take time for yourself, use it in whatever way you feel is best. So just kind of a personal PSA. I think it's a really healthy thing to behave in that way. And so hopefully, anyone who just gets this message just feels good about the way that they spend their holidays, memorials, feasts, fasts, or what have you. Oh, sorry. One last thing, not related to that. Probably should have been a show PSA. Probably should have done it earlier. I'm going to start doing this thing where I will not include some of my commentary most weeks into segments. So there will be some things that are exclusive to the live. Hopefully, this all generates a little bit of interest in viewing the live. But if not, that's okay. But I will keep doing it. There will be one thing a week that I pull that is not going to be part of the traditional segments that I put on YouTube. And if you're on Twitch, obviously you don't see the clips because the clips can't really be individually uploaded to Twitch, but just go to youtube.com, search for Let Them Eat Bread, and you will find them there. So just a couple of things, keep it on mind. Now let's go into our segments portion, and we have a lot to talk about this week. And I probably won't cover it all, but we're going to give it a shot anyway. Ooh. All right, so first things first, I want to talk about the sanctions myth. Now, what is the sanctions myth? Now, the myth, and you don't have to be familiar with it for the myth to be a thing, is that sanctions is better than regular war because, sanctions, we don't have to have our own people there and our people aren't dying and we're very far away from it and we don't see the bodies come back. And sanctions just feels like a good, wholesome way to tell a country, hey, naughty, naughty, we don't like what you're doing, but also we're not invading you. So compromise. The problem is sanctions can actually do a lot more damage than individual military engagements. And part of this is because when you sanction a country's money, you essentially stop them from getting whatever it might be that they need. So if a country is, for example, reliant on external medicine, as many countries are, most countries are not in the business of producing their own medicine. They're getting medicine from places like the US or Europe, sometimes places in Africa, Cuba. But if you are sanctioned and essentially a country says, we're going to punish you if you send medicine to this country, what happens? That country no longer gets medicine and anyone who needs that medicine dies, right? Or gets so sick they can't function or whatever else it is, right? So sanctions can actually be very difficult. Also, sanctions can essentially shut down an economy, and that causes the value of that currency's worth to go down. It can cause people not to be able to deal with any emergencies that come up. They might not be able to buy food. Also, sanctions tend to increase civil unrest because of the effects that they have. And so one of the things that we don't really think about when we put sanctions on a country is that oftentimes the people who get hurt are the people, like the regular Joes and Janes of a country, as opposed to the leadership. Oftentimes the leadership is insulated from the types of harms that sanctions can provide. But regular people don't really have that. And if they are relying on external sources of currency, or the currency of the country is tied to the dollar, which a lot of countries are, or anything like that, where a country has said, hey, I'm going to stop money going to your country, or I'm going to stop medicine, or I'm going to create a trade embargo, or whatever, that can cause civil unrest. Civil unrest can often be fatal for the people who are engaging in civil unrest. We've seen that at home, but also it's very prevalent abroad for a number of reasons. Even if the response is not necessarily violent from the state, you can be in a situation where people are dying, even if the state response is not particularly violent. So all this is to say that when we think about sanctions, when we think about sanctioning a country and what that means, we should really think more holistically in terms of what is it that the sanctions are doing? What harm are they imposing, and who does that harm affect, right? If we don't like the behavior of a country, it makes sense to want to punish that country, and we don't necessarily have to invade all the people we don't like. In fact, I'm a peacenik myself. I think we should not be invading all the countries that we don't like. I also think that we should probably dislike fewer countries, but that's all aside. But the thing is, we think of sanctions as this kind of hands-free, blood-free way to get a country to do what you want to do. And as I mentioned before, that's false. One, because the people who are in power, who are making the decisions, are often insulated from the problem. But two, it's not bloodless. It can cause a lot of pain and suffering, and it can kill lots of people depending on the types of things that that government has to bring in or ship out. Speaking of shipping out, if a country's primary method of generating income for the country and its citizens is to export things, and then all of a sudden there's a trade embargo or sanctions on the country or the country's goods, you can collapse the economy that way too. Just something I didn't mention earlier. So anyway, that is the myth of sanctions. Hopefully we've debunked it. And when you think about how the United States engages with other countries, or how any country engages with other countries, just remember that sanctions aren't peaceful. They are equally violent as an invasion. They're just violent in a different way, and often a way that's hidden from the population of the country who is doing the sanctioning. And that's partly why we've kind of we've been fed this delusion about sanctions, because it looks nicer and cleaner for the citizenry of the country that's doing the sanctioning, but obviously it does not look that way for the country being sanctioned. Okay, so very much on that same note, our continued war in Afghanistan. So Ben, what are you talking about? We just pulled out of Afghanistan. I saw it with my eyeballs. I saw Joe Biden tell people that he's pulling out, and he stood by it, even though the big bad media said he shouldn't do it. What are you talking about? How are we still having a war in Afghanistan? Well, I'm glad you asked. So the way that we are still doing this is because right after we pulled out, we started sanctioning the country because the Taliban was running it, and we didn't like the way the Taliban was running Afghanistan. By the way, before I go any further, it's important to remember that part of the agreement about pulling out and the Taliban not shooting all of our soldiers in the backs as they left was, hey, you recognize that we're in charge here now, right? We won. You lost. We won. We are going to take control of the country, and we're going to set up ministries, and we're going to have the civil service, and we're going to run the schools and all this other stuff, right? There was an implicit agreement, if not an explicit agreement, that when the U.S. left, the Taliban would take control, right? We weren't intentionally leaving a power vacuum. We even tried to get old regime leaders that we liked to talk to the Taliban to kind of make a conciliatory government, a coalition government. Now, it turns out that wasn't the case. The Taliban staffed the government with its own people, but the truth was they had won, we had lost, they were in control, okay? So that makes it particularly bad then when we go into the world stage as the US and say, well, we're going to sanction Afghanistan because we don't like the Taliban and we don't like what they're doing and we don't like that they rule there. But we're not hurting the Taliban by imposing sanctions on Afghanistan. We are hurting the Afghan people. And I don't know if you know this, but it is winter in the Northern Hemisphere, and Afghanistan falls in the Northern Hemisphere. It is winter right now in Afghanistan, and people are struggling to survive because they don't have resources, because essentially their country is being strangled from resources. Recent UN reports have shown that huge numbers, millions and millions of Afghans are on the brink of starvation or have severe food insecurities. And by the way, this is only happening because the United States has said, hey, anyone who touches Afghanistan or tries to help them, we're going to punish your country too. So not only have we said us as the United States are not going to do business with Afghanistan, which by the way would be fine. We don't have to do business with a country. There is nothing stopping us from saying, you know what, we don't like country so-and-so, we're not going to do business with them. Cuba and Venezuela and other countries are great examples of places where the US has just said, we don't want to trade with you, we're not going to deal with you. But when we add the layer of sanctions and say to other nations that if you trade with this country or you help this country out, we're going to sanction you, then it becomes more problematic, right? And that's what's happening in Afghanistan. So even regional players who might want to help Afghanistan or have the resource to help Afghanistan can't do so, because as soon as they do, the United States swoops in with their sanctions and hurts them further. And by the way, Afghanistan is not the only place where we have crippling sanctions in place. We also have them in Iran. When we pulled out of the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, one of the things that we did was start sanctioning the country again. And part of that included medicine into Iran. So these types of dangerous and deadly sanctions are kind of American as apple pie here, and it's definitely something that America has continued to do. Now, there is an easy way to help people of Afghanistan. And look, I heard a lot of news coverage in the mainstream media about the Afghan women and children and what were we going to do, and our pulling out was going to make their lives so much more dangerous. Where is all that talk now? Where is all the care about the Afghan women and children? Where is it? I haven't seen any of it on mainstream news. I haven't seen any of it anywhere. Any of the places that were saying, oh my God, the women and children in Afghanistan, dead silent now. Why? Because they don't actually care. If they cared, they would be sincerely worried about the fact that millions of Afghans are suffering from food insecurity and starvation. But they're not, because the only reason they were worried about the women and children before is because they wanted the U.S. to go back in, because that would help their profits or would help the advertisers. By the way, you've seen that Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and all these companies advertise on media, right? We talked about it last week. Anyway, so essentially, we're at this point where no one seems to care what's happening in Afghanistan except for a very few amount of people. And we are not seeing the carnage that we are causing in Afghanistan because we no longer have bodies there, right? As I mentioned in my segment on the myth of sanctions, it all looks cleaner to us, but it isn't. The truth is, tons of people are in danger of dying or dying, and it's a really difficult time of year in Afghanistan. Just because they're in the Middle East doesn't mean that the ground doesn't get cold and arid. So the easiest solution to this, if you really do care, and I really hope you do, is to contact your member of Congress or contact the White House, because honestly, this is something that Biden can do all by himself. He does not need Congress. He does not need the courts. He doesn't need anyone. All he needs is him and his pen, and I suppose a sheet of paper, to take these sanctions away and to show that we're not a cruel people in this country. Why would we, in defeat, cause so much pain and suffering to the Afghan people? We lost. We finally had the opportunity to give the Afghan people their country back. Now, we don't have to agree with what happens there, okay, guys? I'm not saying I agree with the Taliban or whatever, but they're in charge. We agreed to that implicitly by letting them let us out. And they did end up managing things. And then we slapped on these sanctions, and the country is falling apart. This is so immoral. It's actually kind of sickening. And I hope that we turn this around. I hope that we can convince Biden to stop doing this, because we're killing people. And actually, it's hard to get good numbers now, but it actually looks like we're killing more people now than we were killing when we were there. And it's just mind-boggling how cruel and terrible that is. So I hope that you will contact the White House, and that people will put pressure on the White House to undo this, because what we're doing is disgusting and immoral, and it shouldn't be happening. So, in the United States, elections are coming up, and there has been a lot of talk about the integrity of the vote and the integrity of our elections. And there seems to be a lot of talk about how our democracy is in danger. And by the way, it is. But there's a lot of talk about problems, and I don't often see a ton of talk about solutions. So I wanted to take some time to talk about the United States, how to fix the United States' democracy, and then how we go about fixing democracy in general. And actually, I'm going to start with how we fix democracies in general and how we maintain democracies in general. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the particulars of the US. And I think this is important because it's all well and dandy to point out issues, and there are plenty of issues, and I do appreciate the work that people do in pointing those issues out. But we also need to talk solutions and ways that these solutions can be effectuated so that we're not kind of rhetorically doom scrolling, as it were, and causing people to feel abandoned by the system, to check out of the system, and what have you. So, in general, the way you maintain a democracy is you expand the right to vote, right? You give suffrage to more and more people until everyone is able to vote, right? So, and by the way, there are obviously appropriate restrictions on voting. You know, you might want an age restriction on voting to make sure that people who don't have fully developed minds yet aren't casting ballots. You may want to have, geographic restrictions on voting. You know, obviously, if you're having an election in Georgia, you don't want someone from California being able to cast a ballot, right? You know, there are reasonable limits to democracy. But generally speaking, in order for democracy to continue to function well, you must constantly expand who can vote. You must constantly be trying as much as possible to either make voting easier or to make sure that more people can vote or to make sure that voting percentages are higher. Because if you don't do that and you get to a place where there are constant efforts to disenfranchise people, to remove groups who should be allowed to vote from a logical perspective from the actual pool of voters, you start to have distrust in the system. And because democracies are so fragile, and I've talked about that in a previous video, if there is sufficient doubt in the system and its ability to reflect the will of the people and provide representation of those people, then the people will start to turn towards other forms of government that are less democratic, right? And if democracy is the goal, which for many democracies it is, right, to continue functioning as a democracy, then you have to make sure that you continue to make it easier to vote, more that voting, and you have to continually prove, by the way, that voting actually accomplishes something, because that's one more way that doubt can get in. Okay, so generally speaking, that's how, that's kind of the basics. But what does that look like, practically speaking? So if you are looking for ways to expand the franchise, one of the things that you can do is just make sure it's easier for people to vote. So whether that is mail-in voting, or if there are multiple voting stations in every precinct, or you have people who go around and collect ballots when they're filled out, whatever it is, finding a mechanism where it becomes easier for people to actually do the act of voting. Oh, another big one is make Election Day a holiday, or have voting on weekends, or have multiple days of voting, right? All of these things make it easier for people to vote. So that's the first big category of things to continue to expand democracy. And the second is to make the process of getting ready to vote easier. So this can be things having to do with the amount of information that people can get. So required airtime on national broadcasts you can do. The Fairness Doctrine had something about this, right? Where you'd have to have different candidates on, opposing candidates on, to give their point of views. You couldn't just take one. And there are flaws with that system, but I don't want to really go into it right now. I'm just kind of talking about these solutions, in a broad sense. You can you can get rid of registration to vote, right? You can just say, hey, if you turn 18 in this country, you live here, you turn 18, the government just sends you a voting card and said, hey, you have a voting card, from now on you can vote, right? And here's your, given where you live, this is where you should vote. And these are the candidates who are available to you, right? Making sure that people know about the candidates, making sure that people have don't have to put in extra resources, right? Because one of the things that's difficult, and one of the reasons that we see that people don't vote, is because voting can be expensive, which is to say that if you have to put in resources to vote, you are less likely to vote, right? Now, mind you, there are still very motivated people who, despite the need to expend resources, whether tangible or intangible, to cast a ballot, still find a way to do so. But we can make it easier for them to do so, and there's no need for it to be so complicated. So the result would be that that access to the ballot is that access to voting is expanded. Another thing that some countries done to maintain democracy have been to institute mandatory voting. Now, this has its own problems, and I am going to talk about these for a second. Obviously, mandatory voting makes it so that it is literally required by law to vote. If you don't vote, you receive a fine. Now, in a lot of places, the fine isn't particularly large, but it still is a fine. And some people who want to vote but can't might still get fined. There are problems there. But the fines also can be levied higher. Obviously, a fine just is a punishment that essentially allows the rich to get away with while the poor suffer. Lots of things wrong with fining people for that, but it does tend to raise the percentage of the population that participates in ballots, that participates in elections, because they literally don't have a choice. I actually don't think this is a great method, but it is a method you can use to get more people elected. To get more people elected, my apologies. To get more people participating in democracy, right? So all of these are general strategies that can be used to ensure that people have an easier time voting. Another way you can expand democracy is to switch from a first past the post system to or single member districts. And essentially what that means is you vote for one person to fill one seat. And you can transfer to multi-member districts or to proportional representation system. So proportional representation is an electoral system where you vote for a slate of candidates, typically ones that are given by a party, and then everyone who passes a certain threshold for votes gets access to governance. So oftentimes this happens in national elections where everyone votes for parties, and every party that gets above 5% gets a certain number of seats based on their allocation, right? And everyone below 5% gets knocked out. But for the most part, it does allow for more diversity in the groups of people that end up being elected, because there are just more opportunities for you to be part of a smaller party and get in, okay? And a lot of countries have this. It's a generally great system. But moving in that direction, allowing more people to occupy more seats, not only does it make voting, not only does it help with democracy because there's just more diversity and representation, it also allows more people to actually try and get elected in the first place, because they've got a better chance to actually be involved and to become a candidate, because the threshold for access to power is much lower, right? So this also expands democracy. So generally speaking, those are strategies that can be used to improve democracies. Now, I want to change gears here and move towards American democracy. So there are lots of problems with American democracy. I think the preeminent of which is money in politics. I think the first and most obvious solution is to ban money in politics, to ban stock trades by all members of government at all levels, to make sure that our people in government are well compensated, so that they don't feel as if they have to go and shill for other interests in order to, do well for themselves. I'm not opposed to people in government doing well. I mean, I don't think they should be making like CEO money, but I do think they should be, able to do well. They should be able to create retirement, right? Like they should have good livings, right? Because we trust them with a huge responsibility. So we want to reward them for taking that responsibility on. And by the way, for being pure in doing it, only eliciting donations from individual donors or very small groups, and making sure that if they go through the process, they do it the right way. They're actually someone who's connected to the ground, to the area at which they're from, that they should be rewarded with a good salary, the ability to get some benefit out of it. Now, true, it's their public servant, right? And the point is to make some sacrifices, but I think we can limit the number of sacrifices that they make, right? So, for example, I would rather have them working really long hours as opposed to, being on call time with donors for 5 hours a day, right? Which is a thing that Congress does. So I think that's one way to improve our democracy. I also think that we need to find a way to increase on a legitimate level the number of parties that can participate in this system. Now, our system is pretty much enshrined in the Constitution. That leads to two parties. Two parties are not enshrined in the Constitution, but we have what's called a first past the post system, a majoritarian system, and we have a system where the district magnitude for most positions is 1, which is to say that you vote for one candidate to get one seat. If we move to a proportional representation system, we are much less likely to have this issue, and we get to a place where it is more likely that there is more diverse opinions, and it's harder to be as partisan in that sense because it's not an either or, right? There are other options, and if one of the parties if one of the major parties isn't delivering well for their constituents, then the constituent has the option to go and find another party, a legitimate and viable party, to cast their vote in, and thus to punish the party that would have gotten elected for not doing what it should have done, right? So that would be another way to improve American democracy. The other thing that really we need to do is we need to stop fucking around with who can vote. Honestly, in my opinion, and I get people disagree with me, if you are present in this country, if you are present in a jurisdiction when there's election and you have been present there for 6 or 7 months, you should be able to vote there. And the reason for that is because at that point, the actions of government alter your life in a significant enough way that if we really believe in representation of the people for whom government works, but also manages and legislates against, then we need to make sure that those people have a say in what the government looks like. If not, we kind of get to the taxation without representation thing again, where, and not literally, right, but we have people who are existing in a system where the government is taking actions for and to them, but they don't get a say in how that government is shaped, right? So I think, generally speaking, expand the franchise as much as possible. If you're present in an area for, maybe you can even do 7 or 8 months before an election, you can vote in that election. Honestly, I think we should have automatic voter registration. As soon as you turn 18, you should just have the ability to vote. I also think universal mail-in ballots would be great. The Postal Service is an amazing gift that we have in this country. It is the only department, is the only major bureaucracy of the federal government that we outline in the Constitution for Congress's right to implement it. It's, other than the military, its ability to deliver mail is pretty much unparalleled almost anywhere in the world. I believe at last check, the United States Postal Service delivered over 40% of the world's mail, and did it pretty damn well, despite the fact that there are politicians in this country who are trying to dismantle that service. But while the service is still around and we are not relying on private couriers for all our letters and packages and things, it is extremely important that we use that to give more people access to the ballot. It's very difficult for people, especially because Election Day is not a holiday in the U.S. By the way, it should be. We should have multiple days off to vote. But even if that was the case, you would still find people who were not able to physically get to a polling booth whether because they are differently abled or because they have work or some other reason they can't go. So the solution is to allow anyone who wants to post a ballot. And and by the way, one of the interesting things that we can do to improve American democracy, and this is related, I promise, I will go back, is we need to stop setting the expectation that we will find out the result of an election the night of the election. It doesn't make any sense. There is so much that needs to be done in order to ensure that an election has been conducted appropriately, that the ballots are counted appropriately and safely, to make sure that the candidates are each apprised of their rights when it comes to whether their rights when it comes to challenging and challenging results. All those things cannot happen in one day. They simply can't. And it is, especially in a country so large, it is that we expect our election start making it a cultural point. And everyone who talks about elections, I think, should make this point. We should not reasonably expect for elections to be decided for a week after we go to the polls. And I know it's frustrating, and the media, who only loves to cover the horse race, will be upset with that. But the truth is, you can wait. It's not going to end your world if you don't find out that night. And no matter who the candidates are, so it's important that we start to set the expectation now, especially if we're going to transfer to a system where more people have access to the ballot over a longer period of time, that voting results should take a week, and that should be normal. Now, if they start to take too long, sure, people can get antsy, and that's fine. But I think a week is perfectly reasonable, and that way we have taken this mad dash politics that we engage in the United States and slowed it down a bit. And by the way, this could be good for the media too, right? Because they'll still have their horse race, and actually they get an extra week of horse race, right? Because because numbers, I'm sure, will be reported in periodically, and they can look at who's jockeying for positions or whatever, and how negotiations are going or what have you. The media can still win in all of this, okay? But for us as people, as regular people who aren't necessarily in tune to the media all the time, it's important for us to temper those expectations, because when we temper those expectations and we are comfortable with an election taking a while to count up, we actually make it possible for more people, for system changes to occur where more people are allowed to be a part of democracy, okay? Which is super important. Going back to other ways we can increase access, we need to take a look at how our civil rights are written out, right? There has been far too long where people have been discriminated against in ways that are genuinely unfair. As I said before, voting should be super easy. It should be something that you can do without thinking. Now, you shouldn't do it without thinking, obviously, right? You should consider who you're voting for. You should make, intentional decisions. You should vote strategically if you have to. All of that should be, people should take voting seriously, because it is a serious thing. And if we are able to reform our system, it can actually change the way that we live and go about, our daily lives. But if we make it harder for people to vote, then we get back to that situation that I mentioned earlier, where there's not confidence in the system. Other ways that American democracy can be improved: end gerrymandering, right? Make sure that all drawing of districts is done by independent commissions. By the way, if you move to a multi-member system, the districts have to be much larger to account for the fact that multiple people will be elected from them. You can help with the problem of gerrymandering by switching to a multi-member system. So I think it's really important that all of these things are taken into account. But obviously, the largest one, especially in the U.S. context, is, other than just direct voting rights, of course, is money in politics, because that is the largest indicator that elections don't matter. And unfortunately, for the most part, elections don't matter, regardless of who you put in. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, right? There have been very few exceptions to that, but not a lot of policy has been passed in the past 40 or 50 years that genuinely helps regular people. So obviously, I think that's the biggest challenge of all. But once you drill past that, I hopefully, I've laid out a bunch of ways that you can actually make the system more democratic. Oh, and abolish the Senate. Just get rid of the whole thing. It's useless. Just have one house. Just have the House of Representatives essentially doing it that way. You don't need a second house. It's pretty useless. It doesn't do much. It honestly, where good things go to die. Just make the House of Representatives so much bigger. And by the way, according to some political science theories, the United States House of Representatives should be close to like 700 members. So we are way under par. We are very underrepresented in the country. So anyway, so there are lots of ways that we can improve American democracy. I hope that this has been a little bit of a primer on how we can fix democracy here in the US and abroad. Good. Okay. So yesterday, by the time you're seeing this, a bridge collapsed in Pittsburgh. I'm told by a friend of mine out there it is a major thoroughfare. Luckily, there was snow and there was a 2-hour delay. The snow caused a 2-hour delay, and those people were not traversing the bridge when the bridge collapsed. It has since come out that public safety, which is, I think, one of their policing services out in Pittsburgh, confirmed that 10 people have been injured as of this taping. And a bunch of people were taken to the hospital, but no one has died. So there only was one bus, it looked like, on the bridge at the time. The bus was most of the way over the bridge when the bridge collapsed. And the reason I'm bringing this up is, one, because it's a travesty and this shouldn't happen, but also because Joe Biden was supposed to speak there today about infrastructure and to brag about the passing of his infrastructure deal. And not only is it just a bad look for the president to be there where bridges collapse and be talking, hey, I got infrastructure. The other thing is, too, that it's bad. The major round of infrastructure the United States has was during the New Deal and during the National Highway Safety Act, Transportation Act. I can't remember all the letters. There's a lot of letters in that law. But essentially, before World War II and during the Cold War was the last time that we had major updates to our infrastructure. And by the way, the last major updates were purely military in nature. The reason that roads were built and expanded was because we were worried that there would be a hot war with the Soviet Union, and that if the Soviet Union invaded, we'd need to be able to land planes on highways. So we built highways wide enough to land planes. Which, I mean, why? First of all, I think that kind of skips a few steps as to, why would you land a plane on a highway when there's typically drivers on a highway? But hey, maybe in an invasion, there's no drivers on the highway. I highly doubt that. But whatever it's going to be, that's a major part of the reason why that roads and bridges were expanded during the Cold War. And then before that, it was just kind of part of a public works project with the New Deal. But it's been decades since we've had major updates to our infrastructure. We are the richest country on the face of the earth that has ever existed in all of human history. Wealthier than any empire that has ever been since the dawn of man. Why can't we just have fucking bridges that work? I mean, by the way, the infrastructure plan that Biden passed, I mean, I've talked at length about all the issues with it, but it doesn't even spend that much money. This country has tens of thousands of miles of roads, bridges, highways, and other infrastructure. $1.5 trillion ain't gonna cut it to fix all that. And by the way, we shouldn't just be repairing it, We should be making our infrastructure better, and we should be doing it more frequently. It should be easy to get anywhere in this country. Now, there is lots to say about how infrastructure should be prioritized, whether we should prioritize cars or buses or mass transit or personal transit. And we can have those debates. But the point is, we should be having them more often. We should not allow our infrastructure to get to a point where it is literally collapsing. And by the way, bridges don't just collapse out of nowhere. Bridges typically give signs that they're going to collapse, whether there are cracks in the foundation or steel beams are bending. I'm not an engineer. Don't take my word on this, on like what the specifics are. But bridges don't just collapse out of nowhere. There are signs that the bridge is going to give out, that the road is going to be swept away, that the train tracks are going to break. These things don't just happen. It takes time, because a lot of the infrastructure we use is actually pretty solid when we put it together. We typically don't cheap out on the infrastructure, which means it's not just going to give out in one day. So this bridge collapse is just a symbol for all of the rot that has been taking place in the discourse about how we maintain our country. Look, man, you can't set it and forget it with infrastructure. It's a whole country full of roads and bridges, and people use them, right? Especially where there's snow and where the temperatures get cool. Good catch, me. Actually, let me just put this in the sink. Sorry about that. But these roads and bridges and sidewalks, they all get used. And if the temperature changes significantly, the stone moves and water gets into the cracks and crevices, and it makes it more dangerous and difficult. And the point I'm trying to make is this stuff has to be maintained all the time. We can't just pass a big bill and then wait 40 years. We have to be passing infrastructure bills all the time. Our airports, they need to be renovated and updated. Many of these airports haven't had real updates for decades, and they look like it. If we have so much money to spend bombing children in Yemen and giving weapons to the most brutal regimes in the world, we have money. By the way, we shouldn't be doing that, okay? Just obviously. We have the money to build more roads, build better bridges, build more light rail, build more regular rail, implement more comprehensive busing systems, have nicer airports, have more airports. It's frustrating to me to see the American president go to a city to brag about something that he accomplished that was so paltry in the grand scheme of what it should have been. It almost feels like a nice comeuppance that this bridge collapsed right there as he was going to go. Now, by the way, I'm not saying it's a good thing the bridge collapsed at all. I'm not saying the people who are injured should be injured. I'm not saying anything like that at all. What I'm saying is it serves us right in a sense, not about the individual people. It serves us as a country right to have these bridges collapsing as our president goes around celebrating that he did pretty much nothing, because nothing is what we've been doing for our infrastructure for the last half century. All right, so last week we talked about the Russian and Ukrainian tensions, right? Lots of butting heads going on. There has been lots of news concerning that, and I don't want to go through it because I'm sure you've seen it a million times. I want to talk a little bit about game theory. So game theory is a theory concerning how individuals interact, okay? If you've ever heard of the prisoner's dilemma is a product, the theory behind the prisoner's dilemma is a product of game theory. Essentially, game theory stipulates that you can use repeatable games to predict human behavior, and in certain situations, okay? In the prisoner's dilemma, for example, you have two prisoners being kept in separate rooms, and essentially you tell each prisoner, hey, if you squeal, you get a better deal. Now, the point is to get both of them to squeal. And actually, there's a lot of math involved too, but I'm not going to bore you with that. Essentially, what it boils down to is if each prisoner takes their options, squeal or don't squeal, it always looks better for them to squeal. So then you do that with both individuals, both of them squeal on each other, and then both of them go to jail for a long time, right? Because they've both squealed. So this is a game that police actually use to get people to turn on each other who don't know what the other person's going to do, right? The whole point of keeping them in separate rooms is to essentially keep from them whether, like, they can't collude with their other prisoner, with their fellow prisoner, right? Anyway, that's just one example of a game. There's also, there are games about war and peace, or Bayesian games, they're called. Essentially, they're games with two outcomes. So what's interesting is that game theory can kind of predict what's going to happen in the Russian and Ukrainian situation. And I'm going to explain a little bit further. But so I'm sure, as you guys know now, there has been lots of mobilization by the Russians on the border of Ukraine, but also now the United States and NATO have also moved troops into the area. This is what's called an escalation in game theory. And essentially, what happens when you're dealing with a war and peace game, it always is. So war and peace, hawk and dove, these are games of strength and perception, right? So you never want to be the person who backs down, right? Because then you look weak to your enemy, but also to your people, right? So it's logical that leaders always want to not look weak, and so leaders never want to back down. This is what makes peace very difficult once you started down the war path. And actually, if you look at situations like this, it's very rare that you actually get to a peaceful scenario. One of the most famous Bayesian games, as it were, that did not occur the way that it was supposed to, according to game theory, was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where they were able to avert war by one side essentially taking the L and going home with their tail between their legs and not having a particularly strong attachment to whatever it is, okay? So by not having a particularly strong attachment to the crisis that was unfolding. But it's hard to say that if we will get there in the Russia and Ukraine situation, because right now both sides have escalated, right? So typically what happens in this game is that one side escalates, the other side then has the option to escalate or back down. Now, if they back down, the conflict ends, in theory, right? Or there's appeasement. We're not going to get into that. But in theory, the conflict ends, right? Because you have one hawk and one dove. That's how these games are referred to, hawks and doves. Hawks are war, doves are peace. So what typically happens then is that one side escalates and the other side escalates because it is perceived as weaker or less good to take the side of dove, right? So hawk. So unfortunately, as you move your way up the chain that leads to war, there are lots of hawks involved. And at this point, Russia started as the hawk in the sense that they physically moved more troops to the border first. But there was an option that Europe and NATO had the option to dove, which was to not move troops to the border and to not threaten sanctions and other things. But that has happened now. So what worries me is that we're starting to see the coalescence into a more and more hawkish position that eventually leads to war. Now, it is my ultimate hope that there will not be war of any kind. There are lots of people who have mentioned it, but if there's a war between the United States and Russia, you can essentially kiss humanity goodbye. There will be effectively a nuclear, especially if it becomes a hot war, it doesn't look good. We're both nuclear armed powers with people who want to look strong at the helm. By the way, Bayesian games also work in the nuclear context. Very scary, very scary. So the point of my talking to you about this is that the direction we are heading looks grim. And political science and game theory both predict that at this point, we're going to continue along the hawkish path. Now, it is entirely possible that either Russia or EU and NATO, US and NATO pick dove at some point, that one of them backs down and does not continue to escalate. But the more escalation occurs, the more likely it is that there is war by accident or on purpose. And right now, we have just started heading down the path of double escalation. It is now my ultimate hope that one side, honestly, I don't care which side, one side picks Dove. Because if not, it's going to get really terrifying really fast. Whether that has to do with an actual war being fought on the Ukrainian border or what have you. But essentially, we have taken two groups that are traditionally hostile to each other, and we have caused them to, not we, generally, humanity, is witnessing them begin to escalate. And if they continue to escalate, it doesn't look good. So here's to hoping that one of them pulls a Dove, but I am not optimistic. All right, guys, last story of the day. So we need to abolish NATO to keep the peace in Europe. And there are a number of reasons to abolish NATO. The first of which is it is no longer has any real strategic function. During the Cold War, it made sense to have NATO because the Soviet Union had its own set of alliances. It had now technically the Western Bloc was part of the Soviet Union, but there were also nations that weren't part of the Soviet Union. Essentially, there were a large number of nations that were involved with the Soviet Union in a military alliance that kept them very close together strategically. So it made sense for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to form for those nations that were aligned with the US's side to all be in a mutual defense style agreement. But when the Soviet Union collapsed and all those nations became independent, essentially all the guns that were pointing from the Soviet Union to NATO stopped being pointed in that direction for the most part. But all the guns that were pointed towards the Soviet Union and its successor states were still there. There, of course, was an obvious solution to this problem, which was just to say, hey, Russia and successor states, if you want, you can be part of NATO, because now NATO just serves for everyone's mutual defense. It isn't ideological. It isn't national. It isn't against a particular nation. It was against the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union's gone, so hey, fine, whatever. We're all kind of on the same team here, so if you want to join, you can join. But that was not on the table. And then promises were made to the Russians that, hey, we are going to keep this NATO thing around, but don't worry about it because we're not going to expand anywhere closer to you. Obviously, that was a lie, and we have seen over the decades that NATO has moved closer to Russia in terms of proximity of which countries have joined and which countries are trying to join. So if you just abolish NATO, honestly, we should have done it back in 92. But if you were to abolish it now, if everyone was to kind of go their separate ways, then you remove a lot of the pressure, because then you no longer have the organization of gun pointing, as it were, pointing in the direction that they were during the Cold War. And Russia, don't get me wrong, Russia very much feels the effects of the guns constantly be pointing at them. In fact, you could argue that it's one of the reasons that Russia is doing what it's doing right now, is because it feels that pressure of a bunch of nations who are working together, many of which are nuclear armed, continuing to point their guns at Russia. And by the way, lest we forget that I think it was just 10 years ago now, there were missile silos put in Poland that were for Poland's defense, but were honestly all pointed in the Russian direction. Not physically, obviously, because they point straight up, but the geopolitical implication was that they were pointed at Russia. So you get to this circumstance where all of a sudden you continue to make aggressive actions at Russia, and all of this is being powered by the existence of NATO. So if we really want to keep peace on the European continent, we should just get rid of NATO, and we should establish a new treaty organization of some kind that is generally inclusive of everyone who is on the European continent, if that's the direction they want to go, and is not ideological, and is also not a hostile relic of the past. NATO was born to be hostile. It always has been hostile. It will always be hostile towards the East, whether that's Russia or nations that are close to Russia. We are always it will never not be an inherently violent and provocative. If we want to keep the peace in Europe from now until the next major crisis, or the next set of contrived crises, whatever it is, we need to abolish NATO. It's time. It served its purpose, but it's gone now. And it should have died with the Soviet Union. We still have a chance. We can still get rid of NATO. We need to abolish NATO.
And we're back with our perfectly risen breads that look amazing. After this, we're going to take our beaten egg white and paint both of them, then chuck them in the oven at 425 for 40 to 50 minutes. Check them at 20. Make sure that it's 205 or it sounds hollow when you knock it, and then you'll know it's done. All right, guys, that's all for this week. Take care. Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye for now.